Welcome to Education 333, 337. I am Dr. Lori Benoit of McNeese State University, and we are going to jump into continuing our study of the science of reading, looking at the strands of Scarborough's reading rope. And today we're focusing on language structures, literacy knowledge, and verbal reasoning. So let's go ahead and jump in. We want to identify the three strands. I just mentioned them: language structures, literacy knowledge, and verbal reasoning. We also want to examine methods and materials used to support students' proficiency with these three strands. And our essential learning today is what teacher moves are most effective to integrate language structures, literacy knowledge, and verbal reasoning in different content areas. So once again, we're going back to the graphic that we have looked at several times throughout this course, and we will continue to. We've already talked about vocabulary knowledge and background knowledge. So if you notice, those are going to be that sort of light green or sea green color, and then the darker green or lime green color. And then today we're looking at the very bottom three: language structures, literacy knowledge, verbal reasoning. Please note that all of these are corresponding to the language comprehension area in the simple view of reading. So we talked about this equation in the very first, no, I'm sorry, it's the second module of this course when we talked about the science of reading. But the simple view of reading, just to recap quickly, is this is a multiplication equation, and ultimately we want our product to be reading comprehension. But if, let's say that our student has a 1 for decoding, but language comprehension is a 0, then the result of that equation is a 0, because 1 times 0 is 0. So the only way that we can actually get a skilled reader is 1 times 1 would equal 1, and decoding times language comprehension would equal reading comprehension. So for the purposes of K-12 certification areas and secondary content areas, we really focus on these upper strands. That doesn't mean we ignore, I'm sorry, the lower strands here, the language comprehension strands. It doesn't mean that we ignore the decoding strands. But we really want to make sure we're providing support in the language comprehension strands. This one actually flips it, and so you can see that the language comprehension strands are in the upper position, which is why we call them the upper strands. And these are for the upper grade levels. It's kind of can help you remember that. And remember, the more that we can get the decoding strands increasingly automatic, and the more that we can get the language comprehension strands to be increasingly strategic, the greater likelihood we're going to lead to a skilled reader, someone that can critically think about and critically read text. And when we say, let me go back here just a bit, but when we talk about text, we want to remember that we are not just talking about traditional printed text, but we're talking about reading, writing, speaking, listening, visualizing, thinking. All of these skills are literacy skills. So we want to think about that in our content areas. So we're going to jump in with language structure. Good language comprehension also requires an awareness of and skill with syntax, the rules that determine how sentences are structured. Syntactic awareness refers to the ability to monitor the relationships among the words in a sentence in order to understand while reading or composing orally or in writing. So poor syntactic awareness will also negatively impact reading comprehension. This is often a particularly challenging area for English language learners whose home language may have different syntactic patterns. So we want to remember that syntax is the arrangement of words in a phrase or sentence. The English language has patterns and rules for the way we order our words. It also has some flexibility and variety in acceptable patterns. And even then, speakers and writers are allowed some leeway in these patterns. So semantics is when we're referring to the study of the meanings of morphemes, words, phrases, and sentences. So knowledge of the meaning of text is essential to reading. So syntax is the arrangement and semantics is the meaning. Both of those work together to help readers understand language structures. Literacy knowledge really comes into play when we're talking about print concepts. So the message being delivered in the text, the menu at a restaurant, for example, is set up very differently than the way, for example, a picture book is set up or a novel is set up. The directionality of print is important. So how things are laid out on the page, where our eyes go in the order that we're supposed to put things together. All of these are very important, not only when we're thinking about traditional printed text, but when we're thinking about how we teach students to read maps or how to teach students to break down infographics. I'm thinking of some specifically complex charts. So think about some of our science classes. When we think about the periodic table, for example, and teaching our students to read that, that's a very complex skill. And there's a certain directionality that we use when we are reading that particular chart or document. The distinction between words, phrases, and sentences is very important. So helping our students understand that even though a series of text may be very brief, it can still be a complete sentence. And helping our students understand that sometimes very long sentences are not necessarily better. Sometimes they can actually be more confusing. So just helping them understand the difference between those letters versus words, the one-to-one correspondence that we have with words and meaning. And then, of course, directionality, which we talked about, reading left to right, top to bottom. That's going to be very different in different cultures. And even some of our students who maybe have not had a lot of access to text outside of school may struggle at first. We don't see this, of course, a lot in the upper grades, but we are seeing it in some areas where we are receiving students from other countries who maybe have never been in a school system before. They might be 14, 15, 16 years old, and this is their first time to ever actually come to school and sit in a desk. And so that's something to consider. Spaces between written words and letter order. All of these things we kind of just take them for granted, but some of our learners may need some extra support with this. So not only English language learners, but maybe some of our special needs learners as well. Genres of literature is another area of literacy knowledge that deserves attention. So different types of books or stories are defined by special characteristics. So for example, fiction has narrators, nonfiction has authors, and we could go on and on. Poems have speakers. Innate functions of different genres is also important. So articles in newspapers are intended to inform. Poetry is intended to entertain. Music, even different types of music, perhaps has different functions. So for example, jingles and advertisements might be very different than heavy metal music that's performed at a rock concert, or a symphony that is performed by a local or even national, perhaps, performance group. And they have different functions, different intentions, and sometimes even different audiences. What do they have in common? What is different? The physical layout of different genres is also important. So teaching our students how novels are arranged, how news articles are arranged, where we find different key pieces of information in a news article, how are encyclopedia articles arranged. They all have different constructions. And within our own content areas, we have repeated text types, whether that be visual types of text, such as maps, or infographics and charts, or sheet music, or whether that be uh, novels and books and articles, the way our textbooks are laid out, the way workbooks are laid out. Our students might need a little bit of support figuring out how to navigate these texts. And this is a very valuable skill for them. Also, I want to mention here that we need to be expanding this to the online world. We need to be considering how our texts show up virtually, what it looks like even sometimes on a phone, and how that can be different than the way that it looks in a traditional textbook, because that's going to be a really valuable transfer skill for our students. Verbal reasoning is the last strand, and it refers to understanding what you read by making connections to what you already know, inferencing, understanding metaphors or comparisons, being able to draw conclusions from text. It is a dominant component in secondary text and curriculum. Tests are often part of applying for a job and entrance exams to get into college. So verbal reasoning tests are often part of some of these more complex and nuanced ways that we assess learners for college and career readiness. So an inference is a conclusion one can draw from known facts or evidence. And when we're talking about metaphor here, we're talking about a word or phrase used to say that something is another thing in order to suggest that they are similar. So it's just kind of a fancy way of saying a comparison. So one of the ways that we're going to just kind of explore verbal reasoning and how to support it is Blank's levels of questioning. So this is a framework developed by Marion Blank, a renowned psychologist. There are actually 4 levels of questioning, which move from simple concrete questions to more difficult abstract questions. Blank's questions encourage development of general language and vocabulary, as well as skills in comprehension, reasoning, inferencing, predicting, and problem solving. So level 1 is called matching perception. And some of these examples are for younger learners, but it's very easy to transfer them to some of our more complex content. So it focuses on objects in the student's immediate environment and requires concrete thinking. Responses can be short. They can be verbal or nonverbal, and understanding of these questions develop around 3 years of age. So this, even for some of our learners who may not be reading or performing on grade level, like for example, in our middle grades, this is a good place to start. Find one like this. When we're trying to match, we're looking for patterns. What can you hear? What did you touch? What is this? And so I want you to think about these questions are what we consider those on the line questions. So we could ask students very rote questions. If we read a brief piece of text or we're looking at an infographic, what we could ask them some direct questions about what happened or what this means. When we're talking about level 2, this is selective analysis of perception. These questions about details of objects are known to the student, but not necessarily visible. It involves such grouping objects, describing and understanding particular functions. These develop around age 4. So again, even our students who may be struggling or those that might not be performing at grade level, they should be able to do some of these with some support. So asking them, what happened, who, what, where is. So these are basic recall, asking them about characteristics. So if we're trying to get them to distinguish, for example, between the different types of maybe animals, we're teaching them different types of animals and kingdom, phylum, class, order, those sorts of things. We could begin to ask them different types of characteristics after they've read something or after we've studied something for a little bit. They should be able to categorize here, naming an object from a category. So tell me something that is a type of. So if we were teaching them different types of government, or we were teaching them perhaps different types of industries or things like that, we should be able to ask those types of questions. The next one is called the reordering perception, level 3. These are not about direct objects. The answers require listeners to use their knowledge and higher order thinking. It requires them to make basic predictions and assume the role of another or make generalizations. So understanding of these questions develops around age 4.5. So again, with assistance, our learners should definitely be able to do this. So prediction, what do you think will happen next? And especially asking them, to use evidence from their reading or understanding. What is a blank? And once we've given them some sort of definition and criteria, they should be able then to match that definition to a particular term or figure in our curriculum. Find one to use with this. And so this would be a way that we're asking them to match things up. What could he say, assuming the role of another person? And then how are these the same, identifying similarities? So again, these are level 3 questions. The last one is level 4 questions, and this is reasoning about perception. These answers require learners to use reasoning and draw on past experiences. It requires the listener to problem solve, predict, and provide explanations. So what will happen if? Why did blank, and justify the cause of an event? We could go on and read these, but explaining the means to a goal. What could blank do to that? Or what could blank do to, what could blank use that for? And so what we're trying to get them to do is now at this point, they're problem solving. They are providing some sort of justification for their thinking and reasoning. So these are 4 levels of questioning. And again, it starts with the very, very basic, what is happening, what is going on, but then it's going to work up to where we're actually asking our students to critically think about what is happening and what is going on, to make connections outside of their reading. So here's a list of strategies that we can use for practicing higher levels of blanks, levels of questioning. I'm just going to kind of hit some of these hot spots, but I actually uploaded this full document into Moodle so that you can review these. We want to allow sufficient time for our students to think through and provide answers. So we want to consider this, especially when we're lesson planning. Let's make sure that we're not bombarding our students with questions, especially in a direct teaching mode, giving them time to really think out their responses, whether that's in writing, sharing it with a partner, before we are implementing it in a whole class setting. Repeating the question and maybe even rephrasing it multiple ways for students is very important. Providing sentence completion cues. So using sentence stems, using writing templates, these are very important to help our students model how they need to articulate their thinking. Explicitly breaking down how to answer higher level questions. Again, providing them with some templates, putting them with posters on the wall or having them printed out can be a really good place to start. And then reinforce questions that may have many correct answers. And so letting our students know, especially for some of those more open-ended questions, to take those risks and to go ahead and state their claim and make sure they can back it up with evidence, because some of our questions do have more than one correct answer. So again, these are just some ways that we can support our learners through the verbal reasoning process of their reading. Students need explicit instruction and frequent practice with learning activities that strengthen their knowledge of language structures and literacy knowledge in your domain. Additionally, they need systematic practice to support their verbal reasoning to strengthen the critical thinking of concepts in our content areas. And lastly, as a final thought, I just shared one strategy with you. It's blanks levels of questioning. It can be used with early learners all the way through some of our more advanced learners. Actually, it can be used all the way through college. It's just a way of thinking. And when we look at lesson planning more carefully, you'll see that it actually models Webb's depth of knowledge. And so Blank's levels of questioning, it actually perfectly aligns with Webb's depth of knowledge. We're actually just trying to strengthen our students' ability to practice higher order thinking. Those are our final thoughts for this particular module. Please reach out if you have any questions. I hope you enjoy it.